Welcome back to the Nautical Chronicle. I'm Clossington, and I'm here with the one, the only, the Rhodesian himself, Will Tanner. How's it going, Will?
Hey man, thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so I I think I went a little bit overboard in preparing for this stream, but I hope that I guess the purpose of this whole stream I configured was to sort of elucidate exactly what happened with regards to the borders of Rhodesia during the Rhodesian Bush War. I feel like there's something of the meme of Rhodesia and a certain impression that it gives to people who I guess, hear about it, read about it. But I'll just pull up a little map here. I ended up making about like 2 dozen little maps just to show. We'll get into where all these little figures end up going, but um, nice little flow chart of how the enemy coming in actually organize themselves,
Very
and
nice.
it's very difficult to actually visualize unless you have a
Mm.
map and a little bit of understanding to actually approach the topic. Um, so, Will, why Rhodesia? Why do you have something of an interest in the topic?
Well, my joke answer is that I'm originally from outside Atlanta, and it has many of the same problems that Zimbabwe now has. But more seriously, I think it's
It's
a
very
great,
unfortunate.
yeah.
South Atlanta can get particularly rough.
You might
Um,
rather be in Zimbabwe at that point.
well, to be fair, I once had to like inspect like 10 different like bridges as like an engineer in South
Mm.
Atlanta over a week, and inspecting dank pipes in the South Atlanta ghetto will, if anything, it'll radicalize you, chicken bones and all. Um, but I guess is I guess is your answer that it's a sort of um, worst case scenario in the case of the decolonization project? Um,
Yes, there's certainly that, and that's what makes it, I think, appealing to a lot of people initially. I think the bigger answer is that Rhodesia was the last gasp of the old world. It was this excellence-focused civilization that had adapted genteel British culture to Africa, and built a world around that. So you have the Rhodesian Ridgeback, which is a perfect dog for the area, and that it's friendly with kids, but can also kill a lion or a terrorist.
hmm,
The agriculture was superb at growing cash crops, and it lacked many of the problems that British and American agriculture were facing in the same period. The men of the country were noted as farmers and fighters. It was just it was like the old world you read about, in that it was this excellence focused civilization that was different than anywhere else on earth. And unlike South Africa, it was destroyed not because it was ideologically committed to these things that were becoming more and more distasteful, but because it was a practical country that wanted responsible government and wanted to continue succeeding and continuing representing excellence, and that meant screening out the incompetent from government. And so it was destroyed for that reason, which I think is really appealing and is an interesting way of viewing how our post really World War II, also kind of World War I world, is different from the old world that built the West as we think of it.
well, I I think like to give readers or listeners just a little bit of extra content to listen to. Um, what was this? In February of this year, Will Tanner, Red Hawk, and Paul Fahrenheit and I reviewed the excellent documentary Africa Dio. Um, and part of Africa Dio is set in Kenya
Mhm.
uh, during the decolonial process. Kenya had about a ratio of about one white colonist to 180 black, you know, black citizens. Uh, Compare this to like South Africa, which is about 20 to 80 ish,
Hmm.
depending on the time period. And Kenya gave up pretty quickly to majority rule. This hectic, um, how do you describe colonial or majority rule in African countries?
Yeah, so Kenya is interesting because it and Rhodesia were. This is relevant to your question.
Mhm.
They were somewhat different before decolonization, and that Rhodesia was this, like I said, it was this place of excellence. It was a very serious state. Kenya had some people like that, and I don't want to diminish the accomplishments of the white farmers in Kenya who were impressive, but Kenya's culture and reputation were as a place that the dissipated elite went. So a lot of like the feckless lords who lost most of their money or got caught in some sex scandal went to Kenya and
Hmm.
continued doing the same thing there. So it was largely full of people like that who weren't made of sterner stuff, and they gave up quickly. And then you really got bad decolonization there because unlike the Rhodesians, they weren't well liked. They were really largely disliked by the African population in a way that the Rhodesians weren't. So
Hmm.
decolonization there was a lot closer to the like utter just chaos and disaster and murder of the Congo than it was to the bloody but not genocidal Rhodesian conflict.
Yeah, like the in terms of gradations or yeah, gradations, you have 1 to 180 Kenya with an itinerant sort of overlord class
Hmm.
of bureaucrats and you know not particularly well liked farmers in the hinterlands. And then you have South Africa that's 1 to 5 or 1 to 4 that ended up securing apartheid in the long run. And then you
Hmm.
had the middle case, which is Rhodesia, where 5 to 7% white population was just able to eke out independence for a solid 15 years before being snuffed out due to very essentially the entire world against it. uh,
Hmm.
and I hope to, I guess, articulate exactly, I guess, I guess visually through ye old map autism. I hope to actually show exactly how the entire world ended up against Rhodesia.
Yeah.
So I guess a little bit of like a geography and history lesson, right? Um, Rhodesia was originally settled in early, like late 19th century, early 20th, as a mining colony of Cecil Rhodes's. Um, was it called like
It was
the mining company that settled
the
Rhodesia?
British South Africa Company was what settled Rhodesia.
Right, the British South Africa country. But eventually, the mining boom yielded to land speculation. Rhodes invested so much into railway infrastructure, and with the mining boom gone, the next best way uh, of making profit is by growing cash crops in the ridges and valleys of the mountains.
Hmm.
And they did so very, very successfully. Geographically, um, my I've heard Rhodesia compared to the Mediterranean in terms of how its climate actually appears, or how its climate actually feels. Is that not too far off?
Y-
Um,
Yeah, the just in terms of thinking about it, in terms of things people might know, the northern part of the country that's showing up is like green there was a really difficult place to live. It was just miserable, hot, hard to farm. The southern part, similarly, was somewhat arid, unpleasant, just difficult to deal with. And as you mentioned, that central spine of the country, the mountainous area and the valleys, that was the part of the country that was really pleasant and was well settled. Mediterranean's probably like a fair way of describing it. The way it was described to me by Rory Duncan and others who were there is that that's the place where like you could play polo and have horses and like be a country gentleman, and it was a really nice place to be. most of the year. So it wasn't like the rest of Africa, and it was, like if Virginia was in early fall for a
Hmm.
good bit of the year, that type of sort of thing.
Like you said, like the central area is quite nice. Although my impression of I guess this western border is that it's basically this dry land savanna,
Hmm.
and then the far east is just this mountain range, and then to the north is this big old lake and the mighty Zambezi River. Um, very natural, I guess, natural borders,
Hmm.
very defendable. But um, one of the issues that Rhodesia had, as I mentioned, is demographically, it was in something of in the optimal spot where there's just enough colonists to just barely enough colonists to rule over the country. And the issue of the issue I saw was that in order to settle the land, the British Empire mandated trust lands um, was it the reserve lands for the native tribes who wanted to live this sort of subsistence level
Hmm.
agriculture during like the 30s through 50s. Uh, and then there was the African purchase lands where, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Brits used a black bank to subsidize native farmland acquisition because many were very illiterate and not particularly, you know, knowledgeable of the legal process. Something like that.
Yeah, and for just a little bit of added context on that, part of what was going on is that the method of farming used by the African blacks is just like abominably terrible for the land. This is why regenerative agriculture comes out of Zimbabwe because of the problems they were having. But like the combination of just scratching the earth with a stick and having these roving bands of cattle that are somewhat too much for the grassland was really bad. So the tribal trust areas, they functioned okay from like an administrative standpoint and government and keeping people with the village chiefs, but a lot of the like better farmers amongst the blacks and the blacks who weren't living in the cities wanted to buy land instead of just live on these preserves. And so that's why you got the bought black land that it wasn't farmed as well as the white land, but it was something of a middle ground between like Stone Age agriculture and modernized 1970s agriculture.
Well, like you said, like the reserve land ended up being heavily susceptible to soil erosion,
Mhm.
both because of native practices and because the native population exploded
Mhm.
because of modern medicines being available. Um, but I came across the factoid that a lot of these native like African purchase lands ended up becoming ruinous because of absentee fathers skipping out, and these single mothers with 10 children end up having to try and sustain a farm that they have no right owning in the first place. Um, and it's no wonder why the native or why the colonial Brits didn't particularly want itinerant neighbors. Um,
Yeah. Just to add one point of context on that, the Rhodesians had to, and the British, while they were administering Rhodesia, had to deal with like a large number of paternalistic policies that they used to deal with the African population because it wasn't a hostile atmosphere, but they did have issues like the ones you mentioned that just had to be dealt with. One of the better examples comes from J.R.T. Woods, So Far and No Further, where he's describing the liquor legislation and how the African blacks largely weren't allowed to purchase liquor, which they called firewater, because it just wreaked so much havoc once it got into the tribal lands. And so you had like complaints from black lawyers in Bulawayo or Salisbury who were annoyed about it. But even they were pretty good humored about it because they didn't want the country just falling to pieces. So you had a lot of things like that where it wasn't harsh or cruel. It was just paternalistic, and they wanted to
Mhm.
continue with that.
Right. I also came across in I think it was Redeemed Zoomer's video on uh, population like Rhodesian demographics over time, and he made he started pointing to Rhodesia's native antinatalist policies, where you know, women were encouraged to have higher standards, buy material goods, actually, pay attention to your kid. The state starts prosecuting negligent parents, stuff like that. And the women were mostly susceptible to that propaganda and those laws, but for some reason, the African tribesmen wanted, multiple wives on the reserve doing the traditional farming, and they're very apprehensive about these measures. Uh, I can't figure. It's not there is no trend here in America, but so yeah, you also I also, as a little bit of context, want to point out how there are two main, I guess, tribes in Rhodesia, right? I have this like little handy like line around here where west of it, it's the how do you pronounce the Ndebele?
I just say the Nabele. I
Ndebele,
think that's close to correct.
and then east of it is the Shona. Although I think the population breakdown is something like 15% Ndebele
Mhm.
and 85 Shona, something like that.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Um, and this will actually come into become something of an issue later on when there's the insurgency. Um, so I'm gonna slide over here to my little handy dandy flow chart of, I guess, the African insurgent movement. So 1957 to 59, there's the South Rhodesia African National Congress, aka the ANC. Most people are familiar with the ANC because of South Africa's ANC with Nelson Mandela. Are these actually closely aligned, or was it something of a parent organization
It-
um, for
I
African
don't
nationalists?
I don't know the exact structure. Part of the problem is that it's Africa, so I mean, kind of. They were certainly related and they worked together during the war. That was actually a thing on both sides, where the South African ANC was in its full blown terrorist phase by the time the Bush War had cranked up, and it was assisting the rebels. Similarly, you had the Rhodesians being employed as essentially hit teams for the South African apartheid government to kill ANC officials with some plausible deniability. And so it was a general war on both sides with the ANC being involved. But I don't know, like, I don't know how
Not
closely the
that
leadership was
early in the
linked. Yeah,
war.
yeah.
Uh, but during the 1950s, so how would you describe the how did the A and B roles of the Rhodesian government actually work in terms of government representation? Because this is sort of the crux
Mhm.
of the issue.
Yeah. So there were a couple things going on that made it break out. One was the general decolonization, setting the stage for the some of the blacks in Rhodesia wanting to decolonize, and they saw one man, one vote is the main pathway to achieving that. The second thing was that most blacks in Rhodesia, essentially for all of its history, particularly for this period of its history, were represented by the tribal chieftains in the Rhodesian legislature. Instead of having that much voting in these Stone Age villages we were describing a minute ago, The
Mm,
Rhodesians just let the chiefs handle it and then worked pretty closely with the chiefs to come up with policies that would work. And so the blacks were represented that way. And that worked pretty well for like 90% of the black population, and did okay and functioned well from an administrative standpoint. The problem was there were 200,000 to 300,000 ish black Africans in Rhodesia's main urban areas, Bulawayo and Salisbury, in this period. And because they were out of the tribal lands and out of the villages, they weren't represented by chiefs, but they also generally weren't wealthy and so weren't able to vote, nor were they educated and so weren't able to vote, which leads back into your main question, which is the political system. And it changed a good bit multiple times over the period. The period of the Bush War and the time
mm,
leading up to it. The main system for which they're known and is relevant here is the A roll and B roll voting system, where to vote on the A roll, which determined national legislature representation mainly, you had to have a certain number or a certain amount of property. I think the equivalent is like around 30 to 50,000 2024 US dollars, though I can't remember exactly. Or you had to have a certain level of education. And the amount of education and amount of wealth or income varied depending, where it was a sliding scale. And
mm.
then there was the B roll list, which had some influence on national elections and had much more influence in local elections. And it was relevant here in that it it allowed more of the blacks to participate because the property requirements were much lower. However, it wasn't ever most of the blacks, and so there was some hostility on that front with it. So generally, the system functioned with like a modified property voting system, which mainly encompassed the whites, or it mainly included the whites, though there were whites who were excluded and blacks who were included. And
Mm.
most black participation came through the chiefs, though that excluded the urban living blacks, and they tended to be the ones who were more radical and more interested in decolonization anyway.
Gotcha. Um, and so, in terms of what the gripes of these Black African independence movement types were, political representation is the stated goal, but in terms
Mhm.
of what it looks like on the ground, does it look more like, I guess, the redistribution of white land, more like more schools, more free healthcare, something like that, as the ulterior motives rather than the outright stated goals?
It depends on the period. At first, so from like the 50s, you're describing kind of into the early 60s, they were more buoyed by the civil rights movement in America, and they saw themselves as like civil rights protesters, though they too were carrying out bombings and such already, which is of course forgotten. But the Rhodesians told them to get bent and that they weren't going to deal with that, so they didn't have the whole civil rights thing there. They just told them to get lost, and that largely worked. The next period is where it starts getting foggier,
Hmm.
because that's where a lot more of the communist influence comes in. So it was somewhat the case that they wanted representation in the legislature. However, they also wanted other things. At this period, so before the Bush War began and before the communists were like heavily involved, I don't think, at least from the sources I've read, that they were really calling for mass expropriation of farmland. They did want changes made to what areas were available for purchase by Africans, because one of their gripes was that the best land had been reserved for the whites, and that they were getting marginal lands that you couldn't grow as much on. From what I understand, that's a very debatable proposition, and it was more that they were just bad at farming compared to the white Rhodesians. So you get stuff like that. They also claimed that they were being oppressed, which wasn't true. There's a famous story on that point where the opera house in Salisbury, I believe, had a racial exclusion policy for blacks. And Ian Smith said that was dumb because if they were wearing an opera cape and going to the opera, you probably didn't need to worry about excluding them. And so the Rhodesian government was pretty practical on that front, and the gripes they had were illegitimate and largely made up. So to wrap up, it was primarily the political representation thing. However, I think that was hiding not just them wanting more and better land, but also them not really wanting the whites to rule more than they actually cared about being able to vote themselves, because most were pretty much fine with the tribal system.
Hmm. Well, whatever their motives were, they ended up, you know, committing various acts of rioting, terrorism,
Hmm.
what have you, to the point where the ANC ends up being banned, and its successor, the National Democratic Party, ends up being banned as well because riots and destruction of property, intimidation, yada yada yada, will not be tolerated by a civilized government.
Hmm.
And my impression is that this ends up creating um, you know, further radicals led by the Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, under Joseph Nkomo. And that's where, I guess, that's where the unilateral Declaration of Independence comes in with uh, with the Smith government led by, what was the party called? Like the National
The Rhodesian front.
Rhodesian Front, right? Declaring independence from Britain, who Britain's main gripe was majority rule as a term for, as the condition for granting independence, but granting that would have meant ceding to the radicals who would have inevitably taken over in the case that they actually won the election, or were allowed to vote. Um,
Yeah.
so what happens is that um, the national what happens is that the revolutionary protest movement ZAPU under Nkomo ends up, rioting again and having its leaders captured and going into exile in Zambia.
Hmm.
I
Which could I add one point on that just for
Sure.
context? So before this happened, the Rhodesians, which what we call Rhodesia or Zimbabwe was called Southern Rhodesia at the time, and it was in a federation with Northern Rhodesia, which is now called Zambia, and Nyasaland,
Or
which
Malawi.
is yeah, Malawi. And together they were in a federation for largely economic purposes. But at the time that this was happening, the protest movement you're describing, simultaneously you had the breaking up of the federation, particularly at the hands of the Zambians, where there weren't many whites and they wanted to decolonize. They were much closer to the Congo. So the blacks there had been inspired by the decolonization, so-called success in the Congo at the same time as the whites were horrified because it was just bloody murder and they took in a lot of the refugees. So they were exiled to Zambia because that had been part of the Federation, but it was decolonized at the time and ruled by an insane black dictator.
Uh, Shoot, what was his name? It was
Remember,
it, the
I was just talking with Rory about it. It's some ridiculous name. I can look it up while you.
he had like a white sounding first name and then an African second name or last name. Um, he ends up, it's this he calls himself like a democratic socialist,
It's
on
Kenneth Kanunda.
Kanunga or whatever his name is. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Kenneth Kaunda,
Kawan.
Kaunda.
I remember in the song "What a Time It Was." It's like Kaunda or something
That
like that.
sounds right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So on the face of it, black nationalists, you know, socialist commie takes over Zambia to the north, and he lets essentially these revolutionary protesters, uh, Zapu and Zanu. We'll get into Zanu, but he lets them seek refuge in Zambia up north. Uh, so the issue between the issue inside of Zapu is that they are mostly like Joseph Nkomo and a lot of his cronies are Ndebele tribesmen, from this
Hmm.
western third, while the majority of the population is ethnically Shona, and so their leaders, Sitol and Mugabe, end up breaking off and creating ZANU. Um, and each of these wings has their own sort of paramilitary, with
Hmm.
Zapu having Zipra and ZANU having Zanla, um, and place their little flags in their representative counties. But 1964, all kicked out to Zambia. So in the first, I guess, third of the war between 64 and 60, I guess maybe 72-ish, the first third of the war is a mix of it's mostly just insurgent raids
Hmm.
where, like we said earlier, there's a powerful Zambezi River, and it's completely flat on the other side. You know, the Rhodesian security forces set up, what was it called, like firewatch systems, where you know you have guys on outposts along the border, and if they see any activity, they radio in to the Air Force, where um, you know the security forces would pacify the region and knock out any of the camps or any of the raiders, something like that.
So, to chime in on tactics, that was primarily later in the war once it expanded that you got the fire force tactics with these. Typically, it would be either men on patrol or they'd be set up in some overwatch or ambush position. And then, as you said, they'd call it in, and the Air Force would send in largely paratroopers, though they tried using helicopters. They just couldn't get that many of them for an aerial assault on the raiders.
I think there were
Earlier in
only
the
eight.
pardon?
I think there were only like 8 helicopters in
Yeah.
the country at the time, during
Yeah.
the outbreak.
They
And
got
yeah,
some Hueys from Israel later, but yeah, it was originally like under a dozen Alouette helicopters, if I remember right.
and I don't think people realize that, even though on paper, like Rhodesia's air um, air force is relatively small, it's technically the third largest air force in all of Africa, behind Egypt and South Africa.
It was
Most
also very well run.
Yeah, mostly owing to the professionalism of the actual people running it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so the first few years, right, we have insurgent border raids, mostly tolerated by uh, Zambia, which is willing to host these rebels. What's going on in Botswana uh, and Mozambique to its east and west?
So from what I remember, Botswana was never a huge problem. I mean, it's not ideal having them there, but it has been one of the less disastrous post-colonial countries. And I haven't heard a ton about it in my attempts to
Mm.
read up on and study the Rhodesian conflict, where it was basically fine so far as such things go in the Dark Continent. Um, Mozambique, on the other hand, was a much bigger problem in that the Portuguese controlled it. It was part of their ancient empire, and Salazar was still the leader of Portugal at this point. Ian Smith described him as a perfect gentleman. He was apparently, reasonably good at these things, but the Portuguese war effort was going poorly. They were sending conscripts to this place that's like way on the other side of the world, and they weren't really into it. They didn't fight well. Their officers were terrible. Their equipment wasn't great. So the Rhodesians are simultaneously trying to treat the incursions from Zambia as a police action. You actually have these stories of like guys in their police blues going out to fight the rebels, which is crazy. And at the same time, the Rhodesians are trying to help the Portuguese war effort in Mozambique because that was, to some extent, the more serious threat. Frelimo was a serious communist force. Rhodesia needed to import its oil through the port of Beira in Portuguese East Africa. which, because Rhodesia was landlocked, they could either get stuff through South Africa or through Beira. And the South Africans were alternatingly either helpful or just assholes to them. So they preferred the Portuguese while they could. And to further that, the Rhodesians were really pretty heavily involved in supporting the Portuguese effort against Frelimo, particularly with aerial assaults. It never went well because the Portuguese didn't fight well, but they did try and do it. That situation lasted until the Carnation Revolution, which was a potentially CIA-backed thing in Portugal after Salazar died, where socialists overthrew the successor government to Salazar and replaced it with a very left-leaning one. And that government immediately gave up Mozambique to Frelimo, and utter carnage and chaos immediately broke out, where you have these stories of like cars being driven off bridges so they can't be used again, and just everything being destroyed. And that was in 75. And from that point forward, Mozambique is a communist controlled country that's not only refusing to let Rhodesia import goods through it, but is actively aiding and aiding the rebels as they strike into Rhodesia, and is including its own military power in doing so. At some points, threatening to send tanks over the border and allowing the rebels to set up training camps and receive aid and training from external communist forces within its borders.
So my my impression is that during this period, um, the Zambians eventually, we're describing the middle third from 70 to 75 ish,
Mm-hmm.
where it's my impression that the Zambians got somewhat tired of ZANU, because the the Zapu insurgents are ethnically Ndebele, which Zambia has a lot of Ndebele, but there's something of a there's some tribal conflict between the Shona and the Zambians, causing a little bit of resentment. And even within Zambia's borders, Zapu and ZANU sometimes clashed with each other more
Mm-hmm.
than they clashed with the Rhodesians, leading to ZANU taking more of a foothold in Mozambique than Zapu. Um, correct me if I'm wrong, though.
I think that's pretty much accurate.
And to clarify some of the distinctions between Zapu and ZANU, the Zapu was backed by the USSR, who would while ZANU was backed by the Chinese Communist Party. Both would send leaders of the insurgent groups to China or the USSR to receive training. They receive weapons. Cuba would help both of them. Um, although the training that they did have did impact what they actually did on the ground, what the
Mm-hmm.
insurgents did on the ground, uh, where ZANU, these guys over here, tended to be proper rural guerrillas, with semi-independent roving bands that lived off the land. Trained by Maoists, so they act like Maoists.
Yeah.
Taking villages and trying to surround urban areas. Um, while Zapu tended to be, USSR Leninist vanguardists, preferring conventional battles, very rigid hierarchies of leadership, and ideological purity at all costs. Something like that.
Yeah. The difference in training and tactics was apparently very noticeable to the Rhodesians. Both were still guerrillas, but Mugabe's forces were particularly noted for being much more Maoist in their approach. The swim like a fish in the sea thing was something they much better tried to do, though really that just turned into them torturing villagers and supporting them. But they were better about it, and probably better as guerrillas. And as you said, both groups fought each other about as much as the Rhodesians.
Yeah, and during this middle third, though, were the South African ANC insurgents, terrorists, did they also make trips into Rhodesia itself, or did they mostly keep to the sidelines?
In this period, the ANC was still trying to rebuild its military arm because the Spear of the Nation leaders had all been arrested and imprisoned in 62. So they were still in the rebuilding phase during
Mm,
this, and it wasn't really until later that the ANC was involved in the conflict.
gotcha. Um, I guess. So when did Rhodesia start funding Renamo, uh, the anti-communist guerrillas in Mozambique? Was that 76 ish? I think.
Yeah, that would have been after the Portuguese had left, because while the Portuguese were there, they worked pretty closely with Salazar's forces. And then 75 was something of a transition period. So it would have been either late 75 or
Mm,
76, from what I remember.
gotcha. And then 76 happens, and my impression is that all hell breaks loose. Where the even though where I guess when does Zapu start blowing planes out of the sky? Is that
That was
77?
That was later,
That's
yeah.
later.
But so to add context to all
Mm,
hell breaking loose, there are two big things going on here. One is that the Zambian border was defendable, where they could,
mhm,
even though they had a pretty small white population and corresponding number of blacks they could recruit, they could defend that border okay and deal with things fine. The bigger problem was once Mozambique fell and that border is open. I mean, just look at it. It's like twice as long. They're suddenly defending a border like the size of the Texas border with a population of 250,000 ish whites that they can recruit from maximum. And they didn't want the black forces in the military to outnumber the whites. So the same number of blacks. So it's a tiny military to do that, and they can't really import aerial equipment other than a few trainer jets from France and a few helicopters from Israel. So they're having to defend this Texas-sized border with a very small military force, um, with ground forces. This is where the Gray Scouts come in, where it's men on horseback trying to figure things out. And there are some civilian planes that they're using for scouting. So it was an unmanageable situation from that point forward. Adding to their woes was that in 75, Kissinger pressed the South Africans into no longer really aiding the Rhodesians. They did still help like a little bit under the table, but South African support for Rhodesia was extremely diminished, and a lot of the military police that it had been using to protect Rhodesia's southern border were either withdrawn or stopped doing as much, where that meant that even more border was suddenly now a problem area, and they were receiving fewer weapons and less fuel from the South Africans after they'd lost their ability to import anything through Mozambique. So the war expanded
mhm.
hugely after 75.
Didn't didn't South Africa eventually pull out their military aid due to a border incursion? A very successful border incursion, but a controversial one.
Yeah. So the most people who have heard of the Rhodesian conflict have probably seen those images that come up of like the casualties, where it'd be like operational Elend, 15 wounded on the Rhodesian side and like 2,000 killed on the African side. And there are five of them, five or six that I can remember. There's like Operation Gatling, Operation Elend, oh, now I can't remember the other names. But anyway, those followed the shoot downs of the, I think it was Viscount airplanes, but the passenger airplanes from Salisbury to South Africa by Nkomo's forces, which were horrific incidents. Like they shot down these civilian planes and then raped and bayoneted the survivors on the ground, and admitted to it. And Jimmy Carter and Andy Young patted them on the back as they did it. But so after that happened, the Rhodesians started launching these pretty large retaliatory and preventative cross border raids into both Zambia and Mozambique, though primarily Mozambique, where they attacked the terrorist base camp forces because they had these quite large facilities built up for training with their Soviet or Chinese and North Korean advisors, sometimes close to refugee camps to give plausible deniability. So instead of waiting for the guerrillas to cross the border, which they couldn't really defend at this point, the Rhodesians tried launching preventative assaults on them, which were hugely successful, as you said, killed a lot of terrorists, but hugely raised international tensions, really pissed off the Americans and got us more involved in the conflict for the first time. And because of the international community's outcry, the South Africans withdrew their troops and stopped helping the Rhodesians. And that was after already cutting aid pretty substantially. So it was a big problem for Rhodesia.
Yeah. So at this point, it's well, didn't South Africa, buck up about half of Rhodesia's entire military budget or something like that, or
That
heavily
sounds
subsidize
right.
it?
Yeah, that sounds right. I don't know the exact
Yeah,
numbers,
I don't have the
but
numbers off
it was a
like
lot.
on the screen somewhere, but it was a lot. So 77 would this be something like that? Um,
77, 78.
77. Rhodesia, it's lost one out of its two main allies in Portuguese Mozambique to terrorists and communists. Its border, the responsibility for covering a border has tripled. More aggressive insurgent raids, and then um, my impression is that the Zanu insurgents start making throwing hail marys. Let's blow up some trains or blow up some railways in the capital. Let's blow up some oil
Hmm.
storage units in Salisbury. Blow, eliminating 500,000 gallons of gas.
Which was like a quarter of their fuel or a third.
Yeah, something like that. And they're starting to make the rural areas into no-go zones,
Hmm.
and they're getting more and more ambitious in going farther and farther in. So I guess the net's closing in 77 and 78 and 79.
Right. And it's not just that these attacks are happening on a larger scale. It was really that the Maoist strategy of gradually accumulating territory was working, and that they'd pretty much terrorized the black tribal zones into at least nominally supporting them. For most of the war, the blacks, who weren't directly like fighting for the rebels, were largely on the Rhodesian side or ambivalent, but largely pro-Rhodesian. That lasted until they were able to start really putting pressure on the villages consistently, because it was too much for the Rhodesians to defend. They just couldn't do it. And so they terrorized the blacks into supporting them, which was a big problem for the Rhodesians because it turned half the land in the country into essentially no-go zones, or areas that had to be fought over every new time they were there, like in Vietnam. Simultaneously, though, they were really able to step up their attacks on the white-owned farms, which was a big problem for the Rhodesians in that it chased whites from the country, which meant they could no longer serve in the military. And because they weren't there, their farms went fallow. I
Mhm.
mean, there's no one to buy them or run them. And so the entire Rhodesian economy started self-demolishing, where they no longer had these cash crops for export, more or less only to South Africa, because they had no one to farm them. So their economy and their population was just imploding in these last couple of years of the war.
Like I remember reviewing, I guess, the changes in in Rhodesia's draft laws, and by the end of the Rhodesian Bush War, like all like free and abled white men had to serve like 190 days in the army, um, or something like that, towards the later end. And imagine trying to run a farm where
Yeah.
you're out fighting rebels half of the year.
Some of that was moderated, and then a lot of the farmers who were recruited served in these local militia type units. So it was like the second line of the Rhodesian forces instead of the front line units people know about, like the SAS or RLI or Sella Scouts. But as you said, it was still a significant burden placed on them because even if it's close to home, they're still tromping around in the jungle or the mountains for 6 weeks, Generally, they did it in 6-ish week periods instead of farming. And so the tobacco either doesn't get grown, or if it's there, someone could attack their farm and then it's
Mhm.
burned and it's gone and they're back to square one anyway. So it's a big problem.
Yeah, and I guess one thing that I guess most people don't realize is that when that early African colonization was a lot more mobile than it wasn't in most cases, where you know, farmers or where European colonists didn't really stay in one place and have permanent citizenship, unless your countries like Rhodesia that have a
Hmm.
permanent yeoman settled class. And one of the goals of the Smith administration was to ensure that people identified with their government and weren't these migratory workers that could just leave.
Hmm.
Um, it's just another one of those issues that they had to deal with.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about. I think the best way to conceptualize it is there are two tiers of Rhodesians, like farmers, whites. There were the old pioneer column families and a few like families who had been there for a really long time and had built these large estates. There were also a lot of settlers who showed up there in the post World War II period because England was such a hellhole
Hmm.
more or less from World War II on. And they just were settling there because they didn't want to be in England. And it was a relatively pleasant place if you could afford a farm in the good area. And they weren't loyal to the country in the same way that the older, more established ones were. They just hadn't really been there long enough to care. So once it wasn't pleasant anymore, they just left for South Africa because they had no reason to stay, which was another big problem for
Hmm.
Rhodesian manpower.
Right. And it's Rhodesia really it did a whole lot with a whole little in a
Hmm.
very unfortunate situation. Going from, I think the 1961 census said 220 whites and 1.1 million Africans breeding like rabbits, and by 1980, there are closer to about 6 million Africans, and whole lot less whites, and the
Hmm.
demographic situation is just collapsed. The
Yeah.
borders have collapsed. All the allies have abandoned Rhodesia, and it just eventually just collapses. You can't do it anymore. Um, in terms of what happened afterwards, um, one of Rhodesia was the government of Rhodesia was willing to negotiate a government was that was a government with black politicians, as long as they weren't affiliated with ZANU ZAPU, just as a sticking point, because do, do you really want to form a government with terrorists?
Right.
And eventually, when the government does fall and there are elections, Mugabe wins,
I,
and yeah,
I might just add a little bit of context on that
sure.
front, if that's okay. So in '79, they have a real election that was actually fair and like well done and honest. And Bishop Abel Mazera, I
Hmm.
can't say his name, won.
Miserewa or
Yeah,
whatever it is. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. He won, and he did like okay, and he was in charge of Zimbabwe, Rhodesia. The British and the African terrorists claimed that election was unfair because he won instead of Mugabe. So they made them redo the election in 1980, which is that's where Mugabe won by essentially terrorizing people into compliance. And despite that being the unfair election, that's the one the British gave the green light to and said was fine, despite being on the ground as he was like torturing people into voting
Mhm.
for him. So.
Like in as soon as this psycho Mugabe takes control, what does he do to his political opposition? He
Genocide.
he first makes Nkomo the Minister of Foreign Affairs, because keep him out of the country rather than in the country, and then eventually just you know like you said, you have a military with integrated Rhodesian, Zapu, and Zanu guys all in one room. What's going to with all different tribal affiliations, what's going to happen? You end up with ethnic conflict um, where eventually the North was it like a North Korean brigade has to start genociding Nobele
Mhm.
into compliance.
They
Um,
called it the Gurukuhundi. But yeah, it was they killed like tens of thousands of the Nibele.
yeah, and there weren't land they weren't there weren't any land seizures right away. That came in what the year 2000.
Yeah, so the first like
Mhm,
decade and a half, the British paid for land expropriation. So it was carried out pretty like slowly because the British only allocated so much for it and the farmers were paid. The British then got tired of that and Mugabe looted his treasury to give his soldiers a one-time bonus that they wasted. And that put his treasury at zero. So that's when he expropriated all the white land and gave it to the rebels. That was from like the late-ish mid 90s into the early 2010s. It concluded in 2013 when there weren't
mhm.
any white-owned farms left.
Right. There's so at this point, the most of the white Rhodesians have completely fled the country. The ye old Ndebele have been pacified. There's only one king in town, Mugabe, and was it he every time that any sort of opposition gets close to anywhere close to political power, he calls shenanigans and tries to censor his opposition. Um, so then, well, right after independence, like you said, paid expropriation of white land, very stringent labor codes that make it impossible to fire Black Africans, whether they're good employees or not. Um, price controls, um, universal health care, uh, you know, expanded education, although can't really pay for any of this stuff. So it's all completely diluted in terms of its effectiveness. And then, like you said, they started seizing white land without compensation in like the early 2000s. Um, economy just completely collapses, starts diluting the national economy. Suddenly, you have like was it $40 trillion, 40 trillion Zimbabwe bucks equals like a nickel,
Yeah.
something like that.
You need the $100 trillion Zimbabwean note. It's
Yeah, those
classic African, prudence.
perfect. Um, so do we have any, I guess, final comments or little things that we want to add to, yes, put put a put a final spin on the legacy of Rhodesia?
Yeah, I mentioned the excellence thing earlier, so I won't repeat myself. Other thing to remember is that the American government was extremely cognizant of what was going on in the country for the entirety of the period. You can read the CIA reports; they're mostly unredacted, where it just describes how the rebels were clearly communists
Mhm.
and receiving aid and training from the communists. But then the government's response was to say, "Well, the Rhodesians are racists, and that's mean." So we're going to support the communists anyway, which I think really sticks a balloon in the Cold War needle. It wasn't about fighting communism ever. And you can see it really clearly in Rhodesia because the Rhodesian government was like their Declaration of Independence was essentially our Declaration of Independence with a few changes. Their governing system was ours from the 1820s. It was like a very fair and well done system that ran really well and was a prosperous place and a nice place to live. And we knew it was being destroyed by the communists, and our government went along with that because it just hated the idea of a non-majority rule in a country. It's really sad and just infuriating.
It is, and I would like to thank you for coming on to this show. It's always a pleasure to break out the maps and I guess be able to better stick a pin into point at the map as to where the actual you know the actual stuff is the actual action is going on. Um, In terms of updates, everybody, Old Glory Club's Pony Express Radio should be starting pretty soon. Hop over to there as soon as we wrap up over here. On Saturday, I'm hosting my retrospective review of the Hornblower miniseries. It should be a blast. I'm hosting Endeavor, Iron Duke, Aaron Hook, and Paul Suda. Should be a pretty fun time Saturday afternoon. Is there anything that you want to promote, Will?
Yeah, check me out on Substack at theamericantribune.news. I recently wrapped up a 5-part series on the Brooke dynasty, which were the White Rajas of Sarawak, which is a pretty
Oh,
fun colonial story.
that is an amazing story.
Yeah, they're a lot of fun. In the Flashman book with James Brooke is hilarious. It's my favorite in the series. So check that out. You'll probably enjoy it if you enjoyed hearing about Rhodesia.
Well, thank you for being such an informative and yes, how would you say it? Well put together, dignified guest. Um, I'm next episode should have a little bit more of a rowdy bunch talking about ye old Napoleonics. But thank you, Will, for coming on, and I'll see everyone in the audience on Saturday. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in.